Welcome to tonight's event. I'm Rebecca Taylor, the editor of Jewish Renaissance magazine. So welcome to our event tonight to launch the winter issue of Jewish Renaissance. The theme of the magazine and the theme of our event tonight is Jewish life in the City of London. The city's Jewish community has a fascinating history which stretches back over 1,000 years. But the reason we wanted to focus on this right now in this issue is that Bevis Marks Synagogue, which is based in the heart of the city, and it's the oldest synagogue in continuous use in the UK, is just about to open a new heritage centre which will focus on some of this intriguing and surprising and fascinating history. So that was the reason we decided to focus on this particular place right now. Just before I take you by the hand to explore the streets of London with us, I'd first like to give you a little taster of what else is in the rest of our winter magazine. So we're going to have a quick whistle-stop tour of our winter issue, and I think Aviva is going to bring that up in a minute. Just to say, if you have questions for any of our speakers tonight, then please put them in the chat and we'll get to you and speak to you at the end. As I say, here we've got the cover of our new magazine just out, and we'll give you a quick whistle-stop tour. So firstly, I'd like to have a look at our first piece to kick off. Oh, that's the final page. Okay, Aviva, if we can go to that's it. So the piece on Manchester. We kick off with a piece by Joshua Korber-Hoffman. So Joshua is the winner of our Emerging Journalists programme that we ran a few years ago, and he's now doing fantastically. He's based in Salford and is working for the BBC. So he has been in Manchester, interviewing people in Manchester, and this is following the horrific attacks at Heaton Park Synagogue last October. So he's been to the city and he's spoken to those there, particularly those seeking to build bridges between communities. And in particular, he speaks to an imam and a rabbi who are working to create better dialogue between Muslims and Jews. Okay, moving on to another piece in the front of our magazine. So this is two art projects in Israel and Gaza, one in Israel, one in Gaza. So we decided to look at how arts is helping those who are experiencing the effects of October the 7th and also the war in Gaza. And in the first piece, we speak to Basil El-Mekouzi. He's a Palestinian artist who runs art workshops for children in refugee camps in Gaza. In the second piece by Sarai Shavitz, an Israeli writer and translator, it's on the next page. Sarai talks about the writing workshops that she's leading in Israel to help those who have been impacted by the 7th of October and the attacks. That's families and friends. And both of them are very moving and powerful pieces, I think, looking at the role of art in helping with healing. Moving into our art sections to the theatre section, we're looking at this issue. We're covering the play Please Please Me, which is a play at the Kiln Theatre in London. It's about the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, who was a Liverpudlian Jew. So in our theatre pages, we hear from the novelist Linda Grant about growing up in Liverpool in the 1960s. That's the city that she's from. And she talks about her family's connection to the Epsteins. She talks about sneaking off in her school uniform to the Cavern Club at lunchtime to hear their lunchtime gigs, quickly doing a quick change into her miniskirt and low-cut top. And then also, she talks very intriguingly about meeting Paul McCartney's dad when she was trying to find out if Paul, who lived near to her, if he was at home. And she talks about her cup of tea with his father. So it's a really lovely and fun piece. And we'll be telling you more about our Beatles event with Linda, actually, and others connected with that history, the 60s history, and with the play, which is at the Kiln later on. We'll talk about that a bit later on. So moving into our Sephardi section, we have a lovely interview with our writer Samantha Ellis, where Samantha speaks to the online creator Kiara Shalom. Now, Kiara is the person behind an Instagram site called The Mizrahi Story. And The Mizrahi Story is the most wonderful collection of interviews, photos, and video clips of hundreds of people who have Mizrahi backgrounds, so from Jewish backgrounds from the Middle East and North Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Libya, Iran, Iraq, all the way across the region. The site has over 100,000 followers. It's gone completely viral on social media. But what I think is, well, one of the things that is very interesting about this is that one of its biggest audiences are non-Jews living across the Middle East and North Africa. And for them, this is a real fascinating insight into a story they really don't know much about. So it's brought Mizrahi communities together, but it's really also opened up those stories to a whole other audience. It's a great piece. So then we'll look at our passport section now. So passport is where we cover an in-depth, we do an in-depth report into a city or a place. This issue, we are looking at the City of London. And in this piece, the historian Rory MacLellan talks about Jews living in medieval London in the shadow of the tower. And we're going to be hearing about that in a few minutes. So we're delighted that Rory is here tonight to talk about the city's medieval history. And he's joined by our other guests, Rabbi Shalom Morris, who'll talk about the city's Sephardi history. We've got JR's own executive director, Aviva Dautch, who's exploring Shakespeare's Jewish connections to the Square Mile. And finally, we'll be hearing from Jan-Marc Petroschka about the Jewish Square Mile project. So it's wonderful to welcome you all today. And I'm going to start with Rory MacLellan. Rory is an author and medieval historian. And from 2020 to 2022, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Tower of London, researching the Tower's Jewish history. And he's based at the Royal Holloway University today. So welcome, Rory, and we look forward to hearing about the medieval history of the city.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint. Ah, it's appeared. Okay. So now, Jewish people first arrived in England sometime in the reign of William the Conqueror, so between 1066 and 1087. We don't know exactly when, but they're invited here from the community of Rouen in Normandy. This map just shows the general Jewish settlement over France, the Low Countries, bits of Germany, and England up to the end of the 1200s. And you can see in England, all of the labelled towns are where the major settlements were, and the smaller dots are smaller Jewish settlements. So the community ends up becoming quite widespread across the country fairly quickly. And by about 1127, there is a Street of the Jews in London. So you can see this here. This is from a survey of the lands of St. Paul's Cathedral. In the third line down on the left, where there is the this large red eye, it says "In Vico Iudeorum," so in the Street of the Jews. And this was in the area of the modern streets of Ironmonger Lane and Old Jewry, so quite near to the Guildhall. And so we've got a map here of what was the medieval Jewry in London. And this eventually encompassed 10 of the city's parishes, which were all considered to be in Jewry, which meant that the constable of the tower had special distinct authority over the area. He was the only one who could arrest someone there, carry out investigations, and so on. Unlike the rest of the city, where the sheriffs of London would have authority. And as you can see, it's quite a large area. There's multiple synagogues here as well. One of the main things to note about this is that this is a neighborhood that has quite a lot of Jewish people living in it. It's not a segregated district. So we're not looking at the ghettoized story of Tsarist Russia. There are a lot of Jews at this time who live outside the Jewry, for example, in Southwark or towards Westminster. And there's also a lot of Christians who live within the Jewry as well, because you've got the Guildhall here and a lot of the livery companies. This is still very much the commercial centre of the city. So Jews and Christians sort of living cheek by jowl in this area. Now, in terms of what sort of occupation most of these people had, there is still this popular misconception that most medieval Jews were engaging in money lending. And this has actually sort of hidden a whole wealth of other fascinating stories that were actually much more common amongst the community. Only a minority of Jewish people engaged in money lending, and most of those that did, it was just a side interest. It wasn't sort of their main income, their main business. And really, we're sort of deceived because the practice of lending generates so much surviving documentation that it just makes it look like a bigger thing than it actually was. Instead, most Jewish people actually worked similar jobs to their Christian neighbors. So we know that they could work as doctors. So there was Isaac Medicus, who was a Jewish Londoner in the 1190s, working as a doctor. We know that a lot of them were also traders, merchants, craftsmen, and poorer Jews would work as laborers or as servants. And we also know from some of the things that the Christian authorities try to do against the community that indicates what Jewish people were doing. So in 1271, Henry III tries to ban Christians from using Jewish bakers, cooks, nursemaids, and brewers. So again, suggesting that there were Jewish people working in these roles, having these businesses. And we do occasionally find glimpses of Jews working as nursemaids, as cooks, bakers, and so on in other sources. In terms of their houses, these end up varying quite a lot. Of course, we don't have any standing in London, but we can tell from the archaeology that wealthier families would have had large stone houses with cellars, such as those that were excavated in Milk Street in the 70s and in 2001, where they found two mikveh ritual baths, one of which was in a house belonging to the Crespin family. And this was one of the most important and powerful English Jewish families in the city. So it shows that sort of level of wealth. If you were at the top, you'd even have your own personal mikveh in your house. Poorer houses were probably just made out of timber. You might even have multiple families sharing one. Again, this is quite a similar setup to their Christian neighbors. Now, in terms of keeping kosher, this is something that could be quite difficult in the medieval period, particularly when it comes to wine, because now kosher wine is supposed to be bought from Jewish vineyards. There are no Jewish vineyards in medieval England, so they end up having to import them from Germany or from France, which of course increases the cost. So it means that something like having the proper sort of Kiddush wine really becomes a reserve of the wealthier Jews, or it has to be parceled out in very, very small amounts. And we do even have complaints from a Northampton rabbi complaining that he is only ever able to have a tiny sip each time because it's so difficult to get it into the country. We also know that they had their own kosher butchers working in the city. The London Jewry had a communal slaughterhouse We don't have the names of the butchers that worked there, unfortunately, but we know that Canterbury, which was still quite an important community, but a bit smaller, I think, than London's, had at least two in the 1230s at the same time. So we can estimate that London, you probably had about two most of the time as well. And that the authorities would get quite worried about kosher meat being sold off to Christians. And so occasionally some of our evidence comes from the fact that the king or the Lord Mayor is trying to stop people from buying any sort of offcuts or rejected meat from the communal slaughterhouse. And at this time, there's quite a few synagogues in medieval London, and these are both a mixture of ones which were private family synagogue and then a communal one. The main communal synagogue was the Great Synagogue in Colechurch Lane. So that one is on the bottom right here, listed as S1. And this had been founded by Rabbi Jossi in the early 12th century. But you do then get some other ones popping up as the period goes on. And the community also had its own cemetery. So this is a modern medieval map, well, a modern map of medieval London, showing the site of the cemetery here on the top right, just outside the city walls near Cripplegate. So this is all the site that's later on covered with the Barbican estate. And until 1177, this is the only Jewish cemetery in the country. And so you have Jews from all over England brought here for burials. It's a really important site. And during this time, you do end up getting some attempts by the church and the local authorities to try and limit Jewish-Christian interactions. So they are threatening punishments against them, expelling Christians from the city. And the Lord Mayor ends up banning Christians from renting houses from Jews, Jews from renting outside the Jewry. But we still find that they do these things and that there's actually a very strong relationships going on between the communities, both good and bad, in the same way that people do with any sort of neighbours today. And we even have this fascinating set of accounts from the Tower of London, where it's the accounts of their sort of policemen managing the centre of a jury. And it's just hundreds of fines for quite sort of petty transgressions of, you know, a Jewish convert, well, a Jewish convert to Christianity, Nicholas, who's a goldsmith, he ends up being fined because his servants are caught fighting in the jury, whilst a Jewish man, Aaron Potage, is fined because a Christian man is found in his house after dark. And then we have other people who are fined for sort of going there sort of out of hours and things. So it's clear that there's a constant sort of traffic back and forth between the two communities. But these 2 centuries of Jewish London come to an end in 1290. The entire country's Jewish community is forced into exile by Edward I, and almost 1,500 of them, both Londoners and those from other cities further inland, leave England from London, heading to France. And here, the bottom 3 lines of this document are an entry in the accounts of the Constable of the Tower recording the tax that he levied off each individual Jewish family that went overseas, raising £23 6 shillings from over 1,400 Jewish people. But the community is not actually forgotten, even in that 300-year gap between expulsion and readmission. So it's only in the decades after the expulsion that the heart of the Jewry, Colechurch Lane, is renamed to the name it still has now of Old Jewry, in memory of the community that once lived there, whilst the abandoned Jewish cemetery was known as Jews' Garden and was still known as that for the next few centuries. So again, memorializing this early episode in London's long story of migration and diversity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rory. I'm sure many of us who've walked through the city and have seen those signs of streets and wondered about them. Oh, jury, hopefully they'll be enlightened now by what
Mhm.
you've told us. Let's go forward a bit in time, I think, and speak to Rabbi Shalom Morris. And we're going to speak to Rabbi Shalom live from Bevis Marks Synagogue. So, Rabbi Morris is the rabbi of Bevis Marks Synagogue, and he's going to talk, as I say, about the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community in the city. In the magazine, we look at this history in a piece where we've interviewed the collections expert at Bevis Marks, Chris Musicant, and she also talks about the new heritage, the new Dangor Heritage Centre that's about to open there. So, Rabbi Morris, as I say, live from Bevis Marks, you're going to open our eyes to what is the history of the Spanish and Portuguese community and Bevis Marks, his own history.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me, and good evening to all of you who are watching. I'm actually in the synagogue. This is not just a fake background, so it's nice to welcome you all inside for this short presentation. I'm going to share my screen as well to take you on a bit of a journey. I'm going to focus specifically on the synagogue and Jewish life as it relates to it in the city of London. And this will be a way of introducing the many facets of Bevis Marks, but of course, highlighting the New Heritage Center, the Dangor Heritage Center, as part of the Synagogue Heritage Foundation that will be, please God, opening in the spring, summertime. So, as we all know, the story of, shall we say, contemporary British Jewry begins with what's known as the readmission, but with the arrival of Sephardic Jews as an established community in the 17th century. This will be essentially the first time you'll have a fully functioning Jewish community here since the time of the expulsion, since the time the community was exiled, and that will be carried out, well known, by a attempt by Menashe ben Israel, who is a Portuguese rabbi in Amsterdam, to convince Oliver Cromwell that it would be a good idea to welcome Sephardic Jewry, because of course this would bring about the Messiah. And Cromwell is supportive of the idea. Not everyone else agrees. They're worried about competition in trade. But without going through the whole story, essentially a year later, there is the tacit approval for Jews to be allowed to openly settle in the city of London and to begin to carry out trade. At the time that Jews arrive here in 1656, or they begin operating openly as Jews in that year, the Jews will ultimately have essentially the greatest amount of civil rights to Jews anywhere in the world. There will not be forced into ghettos. There will be, no kind of persecutory type measures. There will be limits on what they can do in terms of trade in the city, because they won't have the freedom of the city of London, which I do have. And they will essentially, they'll have the freedom of worship to live unmolested, and will become quite privileged within the Jewish world over the next few centuries. Now, what's interesting is they settle in a new area of the city of London from medieval Jewry. They settle in the area of Aldgate, just within essentially the eastern edge of the city of London, very close to the wall. And they initially settle or open a synagogue where you see the red circle, which is on Church Lane. They rent a house and they establish the synagogue on an upper floor. And they will use that space, expanding it several times until 1700. By then, probably because of an additional influx as a result of the Glorious Revolution and the fact that you have greater access of Dutch, Sephardi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews that are able to settle in London. The community decides that it's time to build a purpose-built synagogue, and they employ a church builder to build them the synagogue, which of course is Bevis Marks. It opens 2 years later in 1701, and as you can see, is still standing. Thank God. And so that's the blue circle on your screen. Now, what's interesting about Bevis Marks is the name of the synagogue originally was not Bevis Marks. That's simply the name of the street on which it's located. But the actual name of the community is Kahal Kadosh Sha'ar Hashamayim, the Holy Congregation, Gate of Heaven. My theory is, for the reason they chose that name, is of course there's the dream of Jacob in the ladder, where he wakes up and he realizes that he's been sleeping, according to tradition, on Temple Mount, and he says, this is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So synagogues are considered miniature temples. So often you'll find synagogues that are called the gate of heaven. But I think there was an added meaning, because if you look before, the synagogue was located just within the city walls by Aldgate, around the corner from Bishopsgate, further down Moorgate and Aldersgate. And presumably the community thought to themselves, those are the gates to London, but this is the gate to heaven. And so what's interesting about them is obviously there is this keen sense of spirituality, the sense of place, but also the sense that they are part of London, right? They're part of the city, right? They have this association. They know where they are, and they feel confident by this time that they can build a synagogue that would be able to stand for over 3 centuries. So again, it just gives you a sense of that sense of place that this community felt as these decades rolled on. Now, moving on, in terms of kind of understanding the architecture of the building, this is the interior of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, as well as Bevis Marks, and you can see the clear similarity within the architectural style of the buildings. The Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam is much larger. It seats several thousand people. Bevis Marks seats about 500, but it's essentially the same layout, the same structure, and without going into detail around kind of some of the nuances of the Portuguese tradition, a lot of significant similarities between them. But the exterior is another reminder of London, because the exterior of the building is reflective of City of London architecture. And it's very similar on the exterior to many of the city churches, of course, without the steeple. And so in that way, the synagogue was also attempting to blend into London and to feel part of the place. And of course, that's a characteristic of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, a community of people who remain committed to living as Jews, but also to integrating in the place in which they lived. And so if you see old paintings of members of the community, they'll have, tri-corner hats and frilly shirts, as the way any Englishman would have been dressing in the 18th century. And they dressed the same way, but they, would have put their tefillin on before going to work in the morning. So it's a really interesting kind of seeing the way the community found the way to, already in the 16th and 17th century, to do what we have perhaps other communities have only more recently done, which is find a way to live in both worlds at the same time. Now, the relationship with the city was cemented by this annual overture to the Lord Mayor, where they would present the Lord Mayor each year with a gift, often a silver plate or a silver cup covered with sweets. And it was a tradition that other communities had as well, to present a gift, but of course was also about expressing gratitude for the rights and privileges that this community enjoyed, as I mentioned, far beyond what Jews in other places did at that time. We've carried on that tradition within the synagogue of maintaining a close relationship with the Lord Mayors, or as the case is this year, with the Lady Mayor. And so this is some photographs from just a few months ago of a service that we held celebrating the new Lady Mayor. She happens to be the alderwoman for Aldgate, which is our area, and we presented her with a silver Kiddush cup. You can see one of the originals behind her in the photo. They were much larger, the ones that they gave a few centuries ago. But that's an important part of what Bevis Marks is carrying on that civil role within the city. But moving on, one of the other important components is, of course, the maintenance of tradition. As was mentioned, Bevis Marks is the only synagogue in the UK, certainly probably in Europe, and likely even in the world, that's maintained continuity back to 1700, the same community. It's allowed us to maintain the traditions of the community, the Spanish and Portuguese rite, the traditions of the Western Sephardim. And so if you come here, you'll often feel like you've stepped into a different world as you experience the melodies and traditions and all the kind of the unique customs of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, which, by the way, if you're interested, you can learn more about the traditions on my YouTube channel, the Western Sephardim. It's a fascinating survival of a different era, but that still is alive here at Bevis Marks. We still have descendants of the founders that worship here, as well as many others, both Sephardi and Ashkenazi alike. So everyone is welcome. But the final part I'll just say is, we've discovered some wonderful artifacts during this period, including a site map of the synagogue from the 19th century before the site was redeveloped. And without kind of going into detail of this map, you can see obviously the synagogue, which is still there, but all the surrounding buildings essentially were demolished and redeveloped. Most of them now is office buildings. And when looking at them closely, you see that originally there would have been a mikveh and a kosher shop, schools for boys and girls, for infants, housing for the ministers, a yeshiva, etc. And so originally, right, the whole site was an entire world. Everything would have been going on from young to old within this place. And so something that's been really important to us as a synagogue is, of course, maintaining our core function is as a living synagogue that preserves these ancient traditions, also carrying on this important civil role that we play within the City of London and on the national stage, but also in being a place of education, as we have been for centuries. And so that really brings us to the Dangor Heritage Center that we hope to be opening in the spring, summertime, which will be focusing on education. Part of the day will be designated for school groups to come, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, from the local area and beyond, to come and learn about the Jewish faith in a historic synagogue, and of course also open to the public, where people will be able to learn not simply the history of the building, but also look at the collection, which is intact to the 17th century, whether you're talking about archival material, paintings, religious objects, silver, vestments, you name it, is one of the most intact Jewish collections in the world, which has been locked away for a century. And for the first time will be put on display for everyone to come and enjoy. And in this way, we're hoping to live our best self as Bevis Marks, which will be a place of learning, of education, of engagement with kind of broader society, and of course, of maintaining a living, breathing Jewish community. And so we look forward to welcoming all of you, whether on a Shabbat or to the Heritage Center, and to getting to let everyone enjoy this space as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Morris. Thank you. That was just fascinating. And as the only synagogue really now left in the city, when there had once been many, it's just marvelous to hear that history. So I think we'll all be heading down to come to the Heritage Centre once it's opened. We are going to stay in that kind of same time period now for our next speaker, Aviva Dautch, our Executive Director here at Jewish Renaissance. And Aviva is also the inaugural Vera Fine-Grudzinski Scholar at Oxford University's Centre for Life Writing. So, hello, Aviva, and we're going to hear now about Shakespeare.
Oh, thanks so much, Rebecca, and to all our other speakers. And this is so fun for me because normally I'm in Rebecca's seat hosting this, but today I actually get to be an academic, which is lovely. But actually, I'm not just coming at this as an academic, but I have three roles. I'm a publisher, the publisher of JR. I'm an academic at Oxford, but I was at the British Library before then, and I know there are some other people in the audience who also spent time working at the British Library. But I'm a poet, and in many ways, that is the kind of instinct with which I started working on Shakespeare. I'm absolutely going to look at him kind of historically. I'm going to give you kind of all the kind of what's the word? Established, thoroughly researched, and as authenticated as we can information. And I'm saying that because there's been a lot in the press this week that has been very speculative about who Shakespeare might be. And some of that does come from kind of being in the archives and looking at the sources. But a lot of it comes from also reading the work and thinking about the work lexically and linguistically. So I'm bringing both things. I'm bringing the poet's mind. So I hope you'll go with me for this. I'm going to share a presentation. And what I'm going to try and do, I've called this Shakespeare's Jewish Geography. I'm going to try and take you on a walking tour of the City of London, but I'm not taking you on a walking tour of contemporary City of London, but of the City of London in Shakespeare's day. So this is the map that is as close as I can get to the time period that I want to look at. It's the Argus map. It was actually originally called Civitas Londinium, and it was printed, the first printing from Woodblocks was about 1561, although there was a second printing in 1585, and you can see a few things later crept in the second printing, such as the Globe Theatre, which at the time wasn't there. So that, which in 1561 wasn't there. So we're going to do it as a walkthrough. And we're going to look at parts of the city where Shakespeare lived, but also where, and I'm putting them in inverted commas, Jews lived, or rather conversos. So there is this thing of, there was the expulsion in the medieval period, there was the readmission under Cromwell. And I think the kind of more general assumption is there are no Jews living in the city, or in fact in England, in the period in between. So we know this isn't true on a number of levels. After the official expulsion, there were some Jews who stayed. They converted to Christianity. In fact, there was a house of converts both in London and in Oxford that took us to about 1358. We know too that there were Jews who came in and out of the city on their way from Portugal to Antwerp or Amsterdam. There seems to have been some kind of secret network that was getting people out of Portugal. And one of the potential stops on the way to either Amsterdam or Antwerp, which was usually the end point, was Southampton. And a few people stayed and spent short or longer periods of time in London. One of those was the very famous Donna Gracia Nussi, who I'm sure Shalom knows all about. And in fact, some of her family were married into the family I'm about to talk about. But there were also Jews or conversos, converted Jews, new Christians, however you want to describe them, Jews who officially took on a Christian identity, who came either mostly as doctors and apothecaries, brought by, for example, the Lord Mayor Dick Whittington, brought a Jewish doctor over to tend to her wife, although unfortunately she died before he could see her. Some of the other kings brought people over. There were some, a few, a handful. I don't want to make a huge case, but there were some people. What I'm going to focus on though is the um, entry into the City of London of Venetians, particularly Venetian musicians, that Henry VIII brought over. He made a deal with the Doge of Venice, and he brought over two families of Venetian musicians. And I'm going to explain to you over the next 5 minutes or so how they came to interact with Shakespeare. But first of all, I want to look at where Shakespeare actually lived. So let's focus in on this map and let's start off about the period in which he was writing The Merchant of Venice, which we know was between 1596 and 1598. We can date that very, very clearly from references within the play. So we know he references a ship which sank in 1596. We know first performances and publications were in 1598. So that it's a very clearly articulated time period in which he wrote it. He was in London for a while before then. He's famously called an upstart crow. I don't know who's seen the Blackadder style TV series about that. But the first mention of a London home comes in 1596. His name appears on the parish records of St Helens in Bishopsgate as a tax evader, and also someone who never goes to church, which is quite interesting. So the exact location of his house is unknown, but this is St Helens Parish. I'm for a moment going to a later map, 1746, as this map very clearly shows you the yellow boundary. So St Helens Church is the little square, but the yellow boundary gives us the whole parish. But looking at my map from 1561, here you can see St Helens, the church itself, Leadenhall Market. This is the gate of Bishopsgate, and this is St Botolph's without, the church without. We think pretty much it's clear that Shakespeare is living approximately here. So various scholars have pinpointed him to one of these homes. And the reason he's living here is something that doesn't appear on the map, but we have evidence of from elsewhere, is the Bull Inn was there. So in 1584, 4 inns in the City of London were licensed for dramatic purposes. And one of them was the Bull Inn, which is here. It had a big courtyard, so there was acting inside and outside. It wasn't one of the official theatres, but it was licensed for performances. And the Queen's Men performed it, and it's thought that's why Shakespeare is living there, and he's in one of these houses just abutting the Bull Inn. Okay, and me pinpointing the location so carefully is going to be explained to you in a minute. Because here's the Bull Inn, you can see it was a very, very big meeting point. But you can see the Bull Inn was the small performance space. But the two big performance spaces, the curtain and the theatre, that Shakespeare's group, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, performed at, are just down Bishopsgate. So to get to them, he did a straight walk all along Bishopsgate here, or he would go along to Moorgate and round, possibly, to go to the curtain. And I'm pointing that out because Moorgate's going to become important in a moment. If you look at this, I've highlighted the St Helens Church. And the reason is because the scholar Jonathan Bate has looked at the writing of Merchant of Venice and placed Shakespeare's geographical context in relation to him writing that. So here is the Church of St Helens now, and you can still see on the walls the William Bond Memorial. So William Bond was a famous and intrepid merchant adventurer. His brother is the Lord Mayor of London when Shakespeare arrives there. So these two brothers are uber famous in the city. When William Bond dies, he's this adventurous merchant on ships going elsewhere. When he dies, the memorial to him compares him to Jason from Jason and the Argonauts. You know, Shakespeare is full of classical references. If you go to The Merchant of Venice, the very opening scene says that Portia is here in Belmont in Italy. Her sunny locks hang on her temples like a golden fleece, which makes her seat of Belmont Cochos Strand and many Jasons come in quest of her. So one of the questions has been, how does Shakespeare know the story of Jason and the Argonauts? Jonathan Bate theorises he's seen this tribute to William Bond in St Helen's Church in the City of London. And that is the opening thing. And as a poet, you know, writers are magpies. They pick things up everywhere. By the way, it's also pointed out that 39 of the 73 occurrences of the word bond in the whole of Shakespeare's oeuvre appear in The Merchant of Venice. So we have here someone he's living cheek by jowl with, something he's seeing in the city that influences his writing of Merchant. I was very aware that he's writing Merchant when he's living here in 1496, and he's writing something that, yes, is full of anti-Semitism, but it's also showing that the way Shylock behaves is because he's being bullied by Antonio. So Antonio is the kind of William Bond figure, but Antonio is a bully, and Antonio treats Shylock abysmally. Henry Irving, generations later, who gives the first really sympathetic depiction of Shylock in the Victorian period, talks about how Shylock's actions are formed by his mistreatment at the hands of Antonio and the Christians. And that seems to me a very true perspective. But what in 1496 to 1498 would Shakespeare be understanding or seeing or experiencing to make him do this and to make him give Shylock this sympathetic speech? I know there are some scholars who go, if you prick me, if you prick us, do we not bleed, is about the medieval myth of Jews menstruating. I actually think it's nonsense because it's a call out to empathy. And we have other texts elsewhere, which I'll show you at the end, where Shakespeare is talking about empathy for the stranger. So, 1496, he's living in the St Helens parish on Bishopsgate, and he's absolutely obsessed with what's happening to his father. So 20 years before, when Shakespeare was a young boy, his father had been the alderman of Stratford-upon-Avon, had been a glove maker, a leather worker, had been a huge man in his city, had been able to send Shakespeare to grammar school, which was a big deal for a middle-class boy, where Shakespeare studied classics and rhetoric. And then he got accused of usury, of lending money at interest, the very thing Shylock is accused of. And what we know is at the time, 2 years before actually, John Shakespeare had submitted a request for a coat of arms. It had been about to be granted, but because of all this kerfuffle around him making loans to Walter Mussman and accused of a vice most odious and detestable, such as lending money at interest, that came crashing down. He lost all his political power and he spent 25 years of no reputation. We get to 1596. By the way, sorry, this is just the application for the coat of arms that John Shakespeare, William's father, had put in beforehand. And you can see there at that point, sorry, at 1569, he was in good reputation and credit. But the accusation of usury, he's found guilty, destroys that. We go on, and in 1596, suddenly, out of nowhere, the alms that John Shakespeare had applied for 27 years before are granted. Okay. And the coat of arms is actually labelled, the sketch was done by the father, but the coat of arms is labelled Shakespeare the player. This is one of, by the way, the few examples we have of a Shakespeare signature is with this material. What has happened? 1596, Shakespeare has got established, he's earned money as an actor, and one of the first things he spends it on is getting the coat of arms granted to his father. So he clearly loves him. He's the only one of his actors' troupe, the Lord Chamberlain's men, later the King's men, who doesn't use the money they earn. They're in a collective. All the others buy in London. He buys a home in Stratford near his father. So we can see he cares about his father. And his father was a moneylender. Okay. So there's something there about empathy going on. But it's not just about moneylenders, it's specifically about Jews. there's something else that's just happened, which is that Marlowe has published The Jew of Malta, which Merchant of Venice is based on. But The Jew of Malta is much, much more anti-Semitic. You can see there are even lines that Shakespeare's taken almost directly, but with better rhythm. If I go back to my map, I'm going to point out the rows. So whereas Shakespeare's men are playing the theatre and the curtain, the Globe comes a little bit later. Marlowe's men are playing the Rose, and it sells out. The Jew of Malta sells out the Rose. It is the most commercially successful play there has ever been in this period of time. And it's, we get this in Hemslow, who owns the Rose and manages the Rose. We get this in his diaries. Why is it so successful? Because it happens to coincide with the trial of Ruy Lopez and his execution for perjury. Again, I can talk about him more in the Q&A if people are interested. He was the doctor to the king, one of those Portuguese Jews who came, conversos, new Christians, but actually we know his family is sending money to a synagogue in Antwerp. He marries into another new Christian or converso family. He's trading in aniseed and sumac like his father-in-law, as well as being a doctor at St. Bart's. And he's accused of treason. He's the Queen's doctor. He's accused of treason and he's executed. Again, there's a very, very big story there, which maybe is a whole other session sometime. But just to show you, this is where he is the doctor. He's the doctor in residence at St. Bart's, and also he's trading, and his family are trading at Leadenhall Market. So it's very likely Shakespeare is aware of him as the Queen's doctor, as a trader at his local market, as the doctor of the hospital. He has a profile, but then his profile grows when he is accused of treason. Pamphlets go throughout England. He's executed. This ensures the success of the Rose Theatre. And Shakespeare, we think, begins working on his own version, but instead of just destroying the Jew, he begins to develop empathy towards him. I want to take us on slightly because at the time Shakespeare is with the Queen. He's working for the Lord Chamberlain's men. The Lord Chamberlain is the Queen Elizabeth's Lord Chamberlain. We're in the Elizabethan period. One of the things that happens in the play is all sorts of playing around rings. And just to say, whereas all the courtiers around him, including Burleigh, believe Lopez to be guilty, the Queen clearly doesn't, because unlike every other traitor executed accusing of poisoning her, she returns the property to Lopez's family, which she doesn't do with anyone else who's executed for treason. In fact, the only thing she famously keeps is the family ring. And Shakespeare knows it's a turquoise. It's probably something very like this one in the Jewish marriage ring at the British Museum. So Shakespeare has intimate knowledge of the story. He knows the political version, but he has some understanding of Jewish life. And no, it's not because I think he was a Jewish woman, as the papers have been suggesting this week. If you go back to where he was living, here is Bishopsgate. Here is St. Botolph without Bishopsgate. All those converso families I'm talking about, like Lopez's family and like the Bassano family, the Jewish family I'm going to bring in a minute, tend to do most, not all, but most of their marriages, deaths, births, marriages, deaths, baptisms at St. Botolph's. It seems to be the Conversos church, and a lot of these families are intermarrying with each other. So there is suggestions that it is used as a kind of crypto-Jewish community centre at this point in time. Shakespeare is living here. If we go a little bit further along here, he's living here because of the curtain and the theatre, as well as the Bull. The other people working at these plays are these Venetian musician families, the Lupos and the Bassanos that Henry VIII has brought over. I'm going to focus on the Bassanos because the Bassanos are living just next to Moorgate. So Shakespeare clearly knows them. They are performing music for all his plays in his company, but they also live very close to him. So they live just there, looking out on more fields. In fact, we'll talk about moors in a second, just before I finish. Amelia Bassano Lania this week has been in the news because there's a new book alleging that she is actually Shakespeare. I have to say, I do not believe it, but she is very clearly, I would say, now established as the dark lady of his sonnets, or the woman he was having a relationship with, his mistress. She was also a poet in her own right, first published poet in England. She was an educator. She was a big figure at court. She's an important woman. We have two miniatures which people think may be her. This is the one which has the most claim to being probably her. It was misidentified for years, but there's all sorts of reasons I don't have time for. And I just wanted to show you, yes, she's leaded, but she's very clearly white, although she does have the Semitic dark curly hair. According to the sonnets, black wires grow on her head. Okay. She's from a family who are from Venice, probably from Sicily before that. They live in Venice. Well, some are in the ghetto, but they move out of the ghetto when the ghetto is established because they also want to be able to work internationally and publicly as musicians. They don't want to get caught, so they convert for that reason. Although they convert to different religions throughout their time, and it's clear they don't care. They do whatever's expedient. They come over mainly as wind players, although her father teaches the lute, and he teaches the lute to Queen Elizabeth. I have huge amounts of stuff I don't have time for, but the big thing is it's been suggested that her family was of Jewish descent. I would say they were. They intermarry, just like Rodrigo Lopez, they intermarry with other crypto-Jewish or converso families. And there's all sorts of circumstantial evidence to suggest that. Here are the Bassano brothers. If you want more on them, there's lots of stuff at Oxford about them, as well as in the Guildhall and the Charterhouse. But here they are as wind players. Her father, who is really the key musician of this whole six sons, who is this musical family, I don't have time to do this, but he leaves in his will to her and her sister this house in Moorgate. And it becomes kind of a centre. It becomes somewhere the community and the theatrical community are. Shakespeare knows her there, but he probably also knows her or encounters her quite a little bit later. He moves out of the city very temporarily. The theatre goes bust. He's evading taxes. They strip the theatre down and move it and build the Globe with the planks. So he temporarily moves to Southwark, but he comes back to the city a couple of years later as we go from the Elizabethan to Jacobean period. And he moves, this time he rents a house in Silver Street. He's always renting, he never buys, he only buys in Stratford. So this is where he officially has lodgings. And you can see it's at the home of Christopher and Mary Mountjoy. Again, we know this because Shakespeare testifies in a court case about them and their daughter and son-in-law, their son-in-law is a Huguenot. Shakespeare testifies and he signs his witness statement. So we have very clear proved evidence. This has become really important with a discussion of this because in 2016, linguistic analysis, I said as a poet, it wasn't just the handwriting from the signatures, but it's been a analysis of the style of writing, which is in this text and in Shakespeare's plays, but in no other writers of the time, seems to prove Shakespeare wrote this speech in the book of Sir Thomas More. And the speech is about refugees coming from Lombardy in 1517. There are race riots, and Thomas More quells them. And Shakespeare writes the speech Thomas More gives. So it's very interesting because most academics now go, Shakespeare's writing this really talking about the Huguenots. He knows Huguenots, he lives with a Huguenot family. What's very interesting, though, in it is some of the phrases in the speech where he's saying to this crowd, these English rioters, imagine you're the asylum seekers, imagine what it would be like if no country wants you, okay? And you were spurned like dogs. A lot of the language in this speech comes directly from the Merchant of Venice, from what I showed you earlier. Lombardy in Venice is the home of the Bassano family. So, yes, maybe he's referencing the Huguenots too and his knowledge of the Huguenot family, but I think he might be referencing the Jews in his list of where people are coming from at that point. He says he gives lists of other places in Europe, particularly France, but he also says Spain and Portugal, which is where the Bassano family and other Jewish conversos were fleeing. So just to show you, when he's writing this, he's living on Silver Street at the corner of Noble Street. There we go. And not far away, he's in an upper floor, probably able to look over the wall. There's the Barbican. I've put a little blue dot there and I've put it in blue because I know Rory referred to it and our next speaker's about to take it on. This is the site of the medieval Jewish cemetery. You know, from where he is looking over the wall, who knows if he can see the remains. But Shakespeare goes from being embedded in a community of conversos to living in an area which historically is all about the expulsion of the Jews. And that's where he writes about having empathy for asylum seekers. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aviva. That was amazing. We will never be able to read or see Shakespeare again without thinking about some of this background. So we're going to go now to, oh, lots of appreciation going on here. We're going to go now on, as time is moving on, to Jan-Marc Petroschka. So Jan-Marc is an architect who perhaps has fulfilled every architect's dream by living on the Barbican estate itself. He's also one of the founders and a trustee of the Jewish Square Mile project. So we left Aviva at the cemetery, and Jan-Marc, that seems a good place for you to start.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk about largely, Rory talked about the history. I'm going to talk about it more from the community aspect, the project. As I say, I've lived in the Barbican for over 22 years. I'm the chair of the Barbican Association and the trustee of the Square Mile, Jewish Square Mile. It all started with one big question. And that question came from St. Giles Cripplegate, the church at the center of the Barbican. In 2022, Father Jack Noble became the new rector of St. Giles. And you can tell from this photo that he's a rather jolly fellow, hospitable, force for good, bright, courageous, open, forward-thinking, engaging. And as newest member of the Barbican resident community, he asked, not red or white, he wanted to know what lay behind the myth of the medieval Jewish burial grounds just opposite his church. So he invited people he thought would be in the know. So there was the organist Parters, who is a Jewish composer, St. Giles chorister, and composer of mixed Jewish and Christian heritage, a Jewish medievalist who volunteered at the book fair at St. Giles. Jewish neighbors of members of the congregation and others joined, Jewish, Christian, mixed heritage, residents and city workers alike. So over tea and digestives, we consulted books, found evidence, historic maps and articles, and then we came across this map, which is basically around the time that we were talking, Henry VIII. And you can see, and it's very difficult to see, but you can see here the Jews' garden. So there was clear map evidence that we found that the Jewish garden was actually the Jewish cemetery, medieval Jewish cemetery was here. So hidden in plain sight. How could it be that we, who lived at the Barbican for over 20 and 30 years, didn't know anything about the medieval Jewish burial ground, a site of about 1.2 hectare, and with an estimated 13,000 burials, ignored and forgotten? Post-expulsion, the cemetery remained as the Jewish garden, as Rory said before, for several centuries, only built over in the 17th, 18th century. However, the names of some of the streets, like Jewin Street and Jewin Crescent, which we can see over here, still carried the memory of the Jewish community that once was here. With the total destruction on the 29th of December 1940 during the Blitz, those names also were razed to the ground. The post-war Barbican master plan, which put on a rectangular grid, perpendicular grid, 2,000 homes, large art center with the theater, concert hall, two schools. Um, there was nothing left, obviously, and the only thing was St. Giles Cripplegate, one of the very few buildings that survived the war. And that goes back, the original of St. Giles actually goes back to 1090. So it's a contemporary of the Jewish cemetery. And while with the design and post, through the war and destruction of the war, the medieval Roman and medieval Roman wall was rediscovered and became just a very important architectural element um, um, in the design of the Barbican and the creation. Here, for example, you see again the creation of a moat which alluded to the original moat which would have been around the medieval wall. However, nothing was said about the Jewish cemetery. There were excavations, but there's no marker. It was completely forgotten. So where the Jewish crescent was, Jewin Crescent was here before, it became Frobisher Crescent over there. So the names all disappeared. However, within a small part of the Jewish community, the cemetery was never forgotten. And here, especially on the yahrzeit of Rabbi Yaakov Orlean, one of the prominent scholars who was killed during the anti-Jewish riots in London during the coronation of Richard I in 1189. He's celebrated every year, and we've seen that. However, never really questioned why people came here to pray. So it's absolutely fascinating to think that almost 1,000 years after the creation of the Jewish cemetery outside the Roman wall, and albeit being built over in the 1800s and the war, today the majority of the site is a very peaceful walled garden again. It's a private garden for Barbican residents. Um, it's not called the Jews' Garden, it's called Thomas More Garden. Now, when we discovered all that, it's quite clear to us that this is one of the most important historic sites for Jewish history in this country. And our ambitions grew. We want to reveal and mark this site. We want to shed not only on the cemetery, but also shed light and celebrate the Jewish, medieval Jewish community and Jewish life. And we want to learn and to tell and to educate. So our first funding came in 24 from the Culture Mile bid. So we managed to establish a charity. And then in the summer 24, with Gabby Morris, Howard Morris, Susanna Cohen, and here's our local MP, Rachel Blake, managed to present that to the local community. And you can tell from the next photo that it was a huge success. It was the busiest stall and the whole summer party. And we were warmly encouraged by and welcomed by the local community. We followed that up with tours for residents and workers around in the city. We had huge support, especially from Mark Gettelson, Head of Communications and Community Engagement, Campaigns and Community Engagement in the city. We were joined by professional official tour guide, Susanna Cohn and St. Jacobs. And then Michelle Rosenberg here on the left wrote an article about the project in Jewish News, which led Rory MacLellan and Dean Urban to approach us and to basically join us in the quest for revealing the Jewish cemetery and celebrating. So here the picture of both of them together with Father Jack. In September 2000 and last year, on the 4th of September, we then had the first big opening celebration to make people aware of the project, which took place in the amphitheater on the Golf School, which actually is right on top of the Jewish cemetery. It was celebrated with the London Cantorial Singers, speeches by the chief rabbi, by Mira Rubin, one leading academic, also in medieval history, our chair, Howard Morris, and 250 guests, which included also the now first Archbishop of Canterbury, the first woman, I think 106, so predecessor, 105 male predecessors. So congratulations to her. We had a big presentation, exhibition, 2-week exhibition in the church, over 2,000 visitors over 2 weeks. So it was a huge success, and an installation in the center with a hand-tufted carpet depicting the cemetery site and tullets hanging in the aisles to contain the central space in the church. Now, our next step is, of course, about making the marking of the medieval Jewish cemetery and the community, and to further study education and community events. So there is firstly, immediately, probably the depicting of the site, potentially in a 3D bronze model, which can be actually then located at different locations. So you get a sense of how the site sits within its context. There is an overall ambition, much, much grander, and that will take a longer time, possibly through an international competition of ideas, how you can actually mark the entire site and make those 1.2 hectare, this important layer of history visible within today's context. And then, of course, we as a community are together again with our academic leads, Rory MacLellan and Ian Urban and Mary Rubin, will hold a Jewish Square Mile Medieval History Fest on the 10th of May in 26. Some challah baking on the day before. We continue with our walks, guided walks, and we'll have our exhibition going to the London Archives for the Jewish Culture Month in Clerkenwell this year. And all that, which a relatively small group of local residents achieved, started with one simple question, and that was, what's the truth behind the myth of the Jewish cemetery? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan-Marc. That was absolutely fascinating. Also, what great talks we've had tonight. And it's such exciting history. You gave me a guided tour. We were there a few weeks ago, well, a month or so ago now, standing on that site. And it's incredibly exciting to see. You can see it. I think if you can't go into the private residence garden unless you're a resident or with a resident, but you can see it from Defoe Walk, can't you? I think if you're a member of the public, can you see
Yeah, no,
that?
there are a number of locations where you can see it, especially from the high walks around Thomas More Garden, so Defoe Terrace and Thomas More. But there's also one part which is publicly accessible, slightly difficult to find, but it's at the next to between the Museum of London and is a ramp that leads from London Wall into the underground car park below London Wall, and from there you can walk along the Roman Wall, and you arrive at that patch just next to the big bastion I showed you and the beautiful water where you see the girls' school with the amphitheater. So that's where you actually can, as a member of the public, enter the cemetery. yourself.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. And I know Leah Elsie had asked a question about that. So hopefully that's already answered one of those questions. We've had loads and loads of questions I can see in the chat. So can I suggest, as we are quite short of time, that if our guests will agree to this, if people want to email into me, I can pass on specific questions to members of our panel to you individually, if that's okay with all of you. So let's go now to some of our many questions. I think we've got Anne Broom. Anne, if we can go to you, and you can maybe, I don't know if this was a question or a point that you wanted to make
Yes,
about.
thank you, Rebecca. It was just a point I wanted to make, particularly to Rabbi Shalom, because I'm speaking to him from the Bury St Edmunds area in Suffolk, and I just thought
Bevis Marks.
that's right. The land on which the shul is built used to belong to the abbots of
Yep.
my local cathedral here. And
Yes.
every year they used to walk round their land, which was extensive and indeed stretched from Suffolk to London. And it was called Walking the Marks. They are the marks of St Edmundbury. In other words, it's the land belonging to the St Edmundbury abbots. Edmundbury got shorted, of course, to Bury, which became Bevis, and the marks refer to them marking their territory, and that's why it's Bevis Marks.
Absolutely. The street next to it is Berry Street.
Yeah.
And then obviously Berry's Mark or Bevis Marks.
Yeah.
And on the other side is Heneage Lane, which was because when the Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, he gave the land to his mate Thomas Heneage, and so becomes Heneage Place. And of course, other land next door to that, he gives to the Duke of Norfolk, so it becomes Duke's Place. So all the streets have these fascinating connections. And incidentally, the abbots of Bury St Edmunds ran an inn on this site. And when we did a bit of excavation work with setting up this new project, the Heritage Center, we found some food remnants in the ground, which may have been leftovers from some earlier time of people tossing away their supper.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. It was very
Thank you.
interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Anne. And just so we can keep going through some of these questions, Gillian Pollock, you had a question about the buildings around the synagogue. If you would like to, I think, is that also one for Rabbi Morris? Have we got Gillian still?
Yeah, happy to speak about it. So it's been in the news, obviously, the ongoing difficulty we've had with insensitive neighboring redevelopment that would have, built huge towers to our southeast.
That's another question, actually, but the answer.
Oh,
yes,
is that right? Yeah, sorry,
yes.
I thought that was a question you're referring to.
No, that's
So,
okay.
which obviously would have caused significant harm to the synagogue in a variety of ways, including overshadowing and kind of impact on light. And we've been successful to date, probably in part because of all of you sitting here, on people who have objected and kind of made your voices heard, that's inappropriate, and that we're pro-growth, but the growth has to be done sensitively to protect important sites like Bevis Marks. So at the moment things are quiet. It's always important for people to be vigilant, but so far so good. So thank you everyone for all of your support with that.
Okay, and thank you. I think it was Jonathan Rowland who actually asked a question about that. So that sounds like it's good news.
I can ask my question.
Vivian,
Sorry.
yes,
I'm
yes.
sorry about my accent. I'm sorry if there's any road
briefly.
noise. I'm in Canberra. You had the map with all the buildings around it. So my family was at Bevis Marks and left to come to Australia nearly 2 centuries ago, 1860s. And in the 1862 census, my family was actually said to, they put on the census living at Bevis Marks for the street thingy. And that's obvious. And so I was wondering whether any of those buildings were used in the mid-19th century for things like housing impoverished Congregationalists.
So yeah, so some of the building along Bevis Marks probably is reference to parlors and things like that. So may have been some kind of housing, but Bevis Marks is a whole street. So unless you kind of have the specific address to kind of plot exactly
where it was the address of the synagogue in the census.
Right, because so in theory, then presumably maybe they would have been ministers of the community if they would have been living on the land. So it would be interesting
They were not.
to know why they
They,
would have been living
and that I don't know, but I
yeah.
didn't know that anyone could live there. That was the so I'm an historian, but entirely the wrong period. I don't know the 19th century. I know the Middle Ages.
You're welcome to email me. We do some digging.
Thank you. I will do that.
Thank you, Gillian. We've had one from Maxine Sachs. We've had a few from you, Maxine, but I think if you would like to ask maybe Rory about the mikveh. You had a query about the mikveh, I think. Do we have Maxine?
Yeah, I just wondered where it is now. But I think somebody answered that it's gone to the London Museum of London.
I think, and I heard about that because it was in the Jewish Museum, but since that
Yeah.
closed, I think it might have gone down to Museum of London.
I mean, the mikveh was, as far as I know, with the Jewish Museum, and so while we had our exhibition, the Jewish Museum actually came and gave us one part of the mikveh stone to exhibit along our exhibition.
I think it was then exhibited at the Tower of London, wasn't it? I thought I'd heard that too. Yeah. It's making the rounds.
Okay, thank you. We've also got one about the were there graves or bones uncovered after or just before development happened? So yes, there's quite a few questions. What happened to the bodies and gravestones within the cemetery? Is there anyone there? A few people have asked about the cemetery. That one was from Jonathan. So maybe we'll go straight into answers for that. Perhaps again, Rory and Jan-Marc might be good for that one.
Because they do some excavation, in the process of building the Barbican estate. I think they end up unearthing, I think it's 6 graves, but they're found to be empty. Don't know sort of when that happened. It could be that some of the remains may have been removed at the expulsion, particularly if they were only at that point a very recent internment. There isn't evidence historically of sites like this being sacked or desecrated after the population is expelled, so it doesn't seem like that probably didn't happen here, as it didn't really hit other sites. So it may just be that they were removed at the expulsion or something like that. But I also got the impression that the excavations, when they were done, weren't comprehensive across the site, and there probably would be a whole many more burials there. But of course, it'd be a bit difficult to get at them now with everything built on top of them.
Well, I mean, it's. I mean, I've thought about it hard and long also just about sussing out what is the actual level of the garden today and compared to the level of the former cemetery. It's What we know is certainly that the Metropolitan line and Circle line run through part of the cemetery. So there would have been early on excavations. We had at the exhibition a gentleman come and he talked about, I remember reading an article I think the Times post-war describing the scene after the bombing and describing that there were lots of bones at the top of the surface. I mean, we thought about doing some research. Obviously, you won't do any digging. I personally think it doesn't really matter because it's not only the bones, it's also the flesh and the soil of around below the Barbican carries the memory of 13,000 Jews, and that's the important thing. So I think I would always leave a little bit of mystery instead of really trying to find out because it's secondary. It's a cemetery. It'll always be a cemetery.
Thank you both. Let's have a final question from Judy Herman. So Judy's asking about the name Bassanio. I'll read it out just because we're getting a little bit short of time. But okay, Judy, do you want to ask Aviva yourself?
Yeah, I just wondered, could that name Bassano, which one of you amazing speakers mentioned, was a Jewish name. Could that have inspired Shakespeare to use the name Bassanio for one of the leading Christian characters? It's very anti-Semitic in The Merchant, sort of smuggling it in the cause of irony and even to combat or send up anti-Semitism, or am I just being a bit over-hopeful?
No, well, you're absolutely right that it is probably taken from the Bassano family. And in fact, there's a huge number across Shakespeare's plays of variations of names of the family.
Oh,
So
great.
you also get Bassano and Emilius in Titus Andronicus.
Mm,
You get Amelia in Othello, for example. And I didn't
mm,
even have a chance to do that. But, you know, the news story today has been speculating Amelia was a Moor and of Moroccan origin.
mm,
I'd be very interesting to read that research because I'm not convinced by it. As far as we know, the family was Sicilian, like Spain and Portugal to Sicily to Venice. But maybe there has been research, I don't know. But
mm.
they lived, I was trying to show this, they lived on Moorgate. It was their house that backed to Moorfields. And in
Wow.
fact, in Bassano del Grappa, where the brothers lived before they moved, you know, the city that was named for them, the name for that family before, or they were named for it. So there's a whole speculation because the name has Hebrew roots too. But there's very interesting things. There's a plaque on the wall which has a scene that is described in Othello.
Ah,
Opposite the plaque on Misano de Crappa, opposite the square, and this enables me to advertise our Venice trip. If you are coming to us in Venice with Jewish Renaissance to Venice in either May or September, you will get to go there and see this. But across the square from from the plaque, which is mentioned in Othello, were
mm,
two apothecary shops next door to each other. Both of them were Jewish apothecaries. One of them was known as the Moor's shop. Um, so there's all this interesting stuff,
mm,
but there's
mm,
lots. It's not just, by the way, Amelia and Bassanio. Her
mm,
father Baptista was
mm,
Baptista Bassanio. The father of the Taming of the Shrew is
mm.
Baptiste. Originally Petruchio in Taming the Shrew, the very first version of it, he was named Alfonso. Amelia married Alfonso Lania, another converso Jew. These families are clearly huge inspirations to Shakespeare, and there are references throughout his oeuvre to them.
Oh, you've really made my, not just my day, probably my entire relationship with Shakespeare, and it was pretty good in the first place. Thank you very, very much, everybody, and particularly you,
Thank
Aviva. Mm,
Yes, and I'd like to echo that. And I think on that note, we must end as time has really moved on. So I would like to thank so much
mm,
Jan-Marc, Rory, Rabbi Morris, and of course Aviva. You've thrown light on a subject which is still relatively little known, I think. And you've shown us that the Jewish community in the UK has a very long and
mm,
ancient lineage connected to the City of London and by extension to the country that we're living in. And that's something that feels quite important in these times
mm.
where there are lots of discussions about belonging, who belongs where, and what it means to be British. So it feels an important conversation to be having. And thank you all for enlightening us about it. So thanks once again. Over to Aviva now to tell us a little bit more about our upcoming events.
Oh, well, thank you, Rebecca, for putting all this together and to our other speakers. And just to say, we are hoping also for Jewish Culture Month that we're going to do some in-person things in the City of London. So Susanna Cohen, who Jan-Marc mentioned, she is doing a Jewish Renaissance walking tour for Jewish Book Week. It sold out pretty much the minute it was advertised. So we're going to do some more walking tours during Jewish
Mm.
Culture Month in May and June, and also hopefully an event once the Bevis Marks Heritage Centre opens with them as well. So that will come soon. But coming up before then, we have an event about the Beatles online on the 18th of February. We are focusing on Brian Epstein. There's a new play at the Kiln. We have lots of Liverpudlian Jews who knew him, and the writer both of that play at the theatre and of the film that came out last year, Midas Man. So we're going to look all about his Jewish and Beatles identity. We have a walking tour of Hampstead, looking at Hampstead modernism. And we have lots of trips coming up. And the last thing, you'll get lots of stuff in your email tomorrow, but the last one I'll talk about is if you were interested in what I said about the Venetian Jewish musicians, and also what Rory was telling us about the medieval Jewish history, we're going to do an overnight in Hampton Court and Windsor Castle and Runnymede. So in Hampton Court, I will be looking at that Venetian musician story through the eyes of Henry VIII. In Runnymede, we'll do a quick stop in Runnymede to talk about Magna Carta. And then in Windsor Castle, we'll go a little bit Elizabethan, but we also have Anne Seba joining us, who wrote the book about Wallis Simpson, to talk about the Jewish connections around that period. So we will look forward to seeing some of you at those events. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night to everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Okay. Right.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Yes.